April 12th, 1945. The forests of central Germany stood silent under a grey morning sky, thick with the smoke of a conflict that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years. The smell of pine mixed with distant burning, that acrid scent of a world being transformed by fire and steel. Corporal James Walker, of the 761st Tank Battalion, moved through the pine trees with his unit, his Thompson submachine gun held ready, his jaw set with the kind of determination that comes from months of combat and years of injustice. His boots crushed the carpet of needles beneath him, each step measured and deliberate, the practiced movement of a soldier who had learned to read danger in every shadow and sound. They had been told the camp was just ahead, another facility operated by the German forces during the war, and Walker had every reason to believe he knew what they would find there. The morning air was cold, carrying that particular bite of early spring in Central Europe, where winter refused to fully release its grip, even as the calendar insisted on change. Walker could see his breath in small clouds before him, could feel the weight of his weapon in his hands, could sense the tension in the men around him. They had been told the camp was just ahead, approximately 15 kilometers east of their current position, another facility operated by the German forces during the war. The intelligence had been vague, as intelligence often was in these final chaotic weeks, but Walker had every reason to believe he knew what they would find there. He had heard the stories, seen the evidence, and carried in his heart a burning need to confront those responsible for so much suffering. The anger he felt was not hot and explosive, but cold and focused, the kind of rage that had been refined through repeated exposure to horror until it became something harder and more enduring than simple emotion. What James Walker could not have known, as he approached that clearing in the German countryside, was that the next 3 hours would fundamentally reshape everything he believed about enemies, humanity, and the very nature of hatred itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the true account of how one man's quest for justice became an unexpected journey into the complexities of human nature, revealing that even in the darkest chapters of history, the capacity for compassion could emerge from the most unlikely places. James Walker was 24 years old in the spring of 1945, a native of Detroit, Michigan, who had grown up in a city divided by invisible lines of race and opportunity. He had been born in 1921, the son of William and Beatrice Walker, both of whom had come north during the Great Migration, seeking opportunities that the segregated South had denied them. His father worked the line at Ford, one of the first black men hired, when Henry Ford had made his controversial decision to employ Negro workers in larger numbers than most manufacturers. His mother cleaned houses in the wealthier suburbs, returning home each evening with stories about the homes she maintained for families who would never invite her to sit at their dinner tables. Before the war, Walker himself had worked at the Ford River Rouge plant, one of the largest industrial complexes in the world, a sprawling facility that employed over 100,000 workers at its peak. He had been assigned to the foundry, brutal work in hellish heat, pouring molten metal into molds day after day. It was one of the few positions where black workers were allowed, jobs that white workers generally avoided due to the dangerous conditions and physically demanding nature of the labor. Walker had accepted this placement without complaint, grateful for steady employment during years when many men had none, but always aware that his labor was valued while his humanity was questioned. He could produce steel for American industry, but could not eat at certain lunch counters or live in certain neighborhoods. The contradiction was not lost on him even then. His education had been cut short after high school, not because he lacked ability, but because college was not an option for a young black man whose family needed his income to survive. But Walker had been a voracious reader, borrowing books from the public library, educating himself in history and literature and philosophy during whatever free hours he could find. He had read Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, had absorbed their arguments about double consciousness and the color line, had understood intellectually what he experienced daily in practice. This self-education would serve him well during the war, giving him frameworks for understanding the ideological dimensions of the conflict that many of his fellow soldiers never fully grasped. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, Walker had enlisted with a mixture of patriotism and pragmatism. He loved his country, despite how his country often failed to love him back. The military, he reasoned, might offer opportunities that civilian life denied him, and perhaps, just perhaps, proving himself in service might help change minds back home. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Walker had enlisted with a mixture of patriotism and pragmatism. He loved his country, despite how his country often failed to love him back. The military, he reasoned, might offer opportunities that civilian life denied him, and perhaps, just perhaps, proving himself in service might help change minds back home. He remembered the recruiting office in downtown Detroit, the white sergeant who had looked at him with barely concealed skepticism before processing his paperwork, the physical examination, where he had been separated from white recruits, the oath of service that he had taken with genuine conviction, despite understanding that he would be serving a nation that did not grant him full citizenship rights. The reality of military service had been more complicated than Walker imagined. The American armed forces remained segregated throughout the war, with black soldiers assigned to separate units, often relegated to supply and support roles rather than combat positions. The official reasoning, couched in bureaucratic language about unit cohesion and military efficiency, barely concealed the racism that undergirded these policies. Black soldiers were deemed suitable for loading cargo, driving trucks, cooking meals, digging latrines, but not for leading men in battle or operating complex weapon systems. The assumption was that they lacked the intelligence, courage, or capacity for such responsibilities, assumptions that black soldiers disproved daily, but that institutional policies refused to acknowledge. Walker had spent the first year of his service in various stateside training facilities, enduring the double burden of preparing for war while navigating the constant indignities of segregation. He trained on bases where German prisoners of war ate in dining facilities that black American soldiers could not enter. He saw enemy combatants treated with more courtesy and respect than loyal American citizens who happened to be black. The irony was not subtle, and it reinforced his understanding of how deeply racism was embedded in American institutions, even as those institutions mobilized to fight a regime whose racial ideology was even more explicitly murderous. The 761st Tank Battalion was one of the few all-black armored units to see significant action in the European theater. Formed in 1942 and trained at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, the unit had faced skepticism from military leadership about whether black soldiers could effectively operate tanks, complex machines that required technical skill and coordinated teamwork. The battalion had proven those skeptics wrong repeatedly, but Walker knew that no amount of performance would fully overcome the prejudices that shaped how they were perceived and deployed. The months that followed had tested every man in the battalion. They had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, endured the bitter cold of the Battle of the Bulge, and pushed eastward into Germany itself as the forces of the German military began their final collapse. Throughout these trials, Walker had proven himself a capable and courageous soldier, earning his corporal's stripes through skill and dedication. But he had also accumulated experiences that left him hardened, experiences that fueled a growing anger that sometimes threatened to consume him. There had been the village in France where they had discovered evidence of reprisals against civilians, families destroyed, for the crime of resistance. There had been the frozen bodies of American soldiers found in Belgian snow, men who had been taken during the German offensive in December and never returned. And most recently, there had been the liberation of a satellite facility near Weimar, where Walker and his unit had witnessed firsthand the systematic cruelty that had been inflicted on prisoners, people reduced to walking skeletons, their eyes hollow with suffering that no words could adequately describe. That last experience had changed something fundamental in Walker. He had always known intellectually about the horrors perpetrated by the German regime during the war, but knowing and seeing were entirely different things. The faces of those survivors haunted his dreams, their gratitude mixed with a brokenness that would take years, perhaps lifetimes, to heal. In the days after that liberation, Walker found himself consumed by a cold fury, a determination that those responsible must face justice, must understand the consequences of their actions. So when the order came down on the morning of April 12th that his unit would be investigating another facility approximately 15 kilometers to the east, Walker had volunteered immediately. The intelligence was vague, as it often was in those chaotic final weeks. The camp was believed to be some kind of military installation, possibly a training facility or supply depot, though reports from local civilians suggested it might be something else. Whatever they found there, Walker was ready. He had questions that demanded answers, and a reckoning that felt long overdue. The march through the forest took nearly 2 hours. Walker's unit consisted of 12 men, led by Lieutenant Morrison, a white officer from Maryland who had earned the respect of his soldiers through competence and a willingness to fight alongside them rather than simply command from behind. They moved cautiously, aware that despite the apparent collapse of organized German resistance in this sector, isolated units might still pose a threat. The war in Europe was entering its final days, but desperate men could still be dangerous. As they approached the coordinates they had been given, the forest began to thin, and they could see ahead a clearing with several wooden buildings surrounded by a wire fence. It looked like dozens of other installations they had encountered, functional and austere, built for purpose rather than comfort. But there was something different about this place, something Walker noticed immediately but could not quite identify. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. No guards were visible at the perimeter, and from within the compound, instead of the expected silence of abandonment, came sounds of activity, voices speaking in German, movement. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand, signaling the unit to halt. They took position at the tree line, weapons ready, observing. For several minutes they watched, trying to understand what they were seeing. Men in German military uniforms were moving between the buildings, but their movements seemed purposeful rather than defensive. Some carried boxes, others tended to what appeared to be a small garden plot near one structure. There was no sense of panic or preparation for combat, no indication they were aware of the approaching American soldiers. Then Morrison spoke quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for his men to hear. "Let us observe a bit longer before we announce ourselves. Something here does not add up." Walker felt his grip tighten on his weapon. Every instinct told him to move forward, to confront these men who wore the uniform of a regime that had caused so much suffering. But discipline held him in place, and Morrison was right. There was something unusual about this scene, something that warranted caution. It was then that Walker saw her. A woman emerged from one of the buildings, elderly, perhaps 70 years old, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a basket. She walked without fear among the German soldiers, pausing to speak with one of them, her manner suggesting familiarity rather than coercion. The soldier she spoke with nodded respectfully, then helped her carry the basket toward another building. Behind her came 2 more civilians, a man and a younger woman, both thin but not starved, both moving freely through the compound. "What the hell is this place?" muttered Corporal Davis, positioned to Walker's left. Morrison pulled out his binoculars, scanning the compound more carefully. "I see German soldiers and civilians together, no weapons visible on any of them, no guard posts, no defensive positions." He lowered the binoculars, his expression troubled. "This is not what I expected." Neither was it what Walker expected, and the confusion only deepened his anger. Was this some kind of deception, a trap designed to catch American forces off guard, or was it something else entirely, something that did not fit into the clear categories of enemy and victim that Walker had come to rely upon? Morrison made his decision. "We go in, but weapons ready and eyes open. Davis, Walker, you are with me at point. Everyone else, spread out and cover us. If this goes wrong, do not hesitate." They moved forward in formation, emerging from the tree line and advancing across the open ground toward the gate. It took perhaps 30 seconds before they were noticed, and Walker watched carefully for the reaction. The first German soldier to see them froze, his eyes widening. Then he called out something in German. Other soldiers appeared, but none of them reached for weapons. Instead, they raised their hands, not in surrender exactly, but in a gesture that suggested they meant no threat. An older man in a German officer's uniform emerged from the largest building, walking toward the gate to meet them. He was perhaps 50 years old, with grey in his hair and a face marked by exhaustion. He stopped several meters from the fence, keeping his hands visible, and spoke in accented but clear English. "Welcome, American soldiers. We have been expecting someone to arrive eventually. My name is Major Klaus Hoffmann, and this facility is under my command. We have no weapons and offer no resistance." Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his weapon still raised. "Major Hoffmann, I am Lieutenant Morrison of the United States Army. You will order your men to assemble in the open where we can see them, and you will explain exactly what this facility is." Hoffmann nodded slowly. "Of course, Lieutenant. But perhaps you should see for yourself first. Words alone will not explain what you have found here." Something in the Major's tone, say a weariness mixed with something that might have been resignation or even relief, made Morrison pause. He glanced at Walker, then back at Hoffmann. "Very well. But understand that any deception will be met with immediate consequences." "There will be no deception," Hoffmann replied quietly. "We have lived with enough lies. It is time for truth." What followed was one of the strangest hours of James Walker's military service. As American soldiers spread through the compound, weapons ready for any sign of threat, they discovered not a military installation or prison camp, but something that defied easy categorization. The facility housed approximately 40 people, roughly divided between German military personnel and civilians of various nationalities. But the relationship between them was not what Walker expected. The buildings, they discovered, had been converted into living quarters, a medical facility, and common areas. The German soldiers present were all, according to Major Hoffmann, men who had been wounded or declared unfit for combat service. Some bore visible injuries, missing limbs or bearing scars from burns. Others appeared physically intact but carried themselves with the careful movements of men dealing with internal wounds, the kind that did not show on the surface, and the civilians were not prisoners but refugees. Hoffmann explained as Morrison and several soldiers, including Walker, followed him through the compound. Most were displaced by the conflict, people whose homes had been destroyed who had nowhere else to go. Some had been in labor camps initially, yes, but when I arrived here last autumn and saw what was truly happening, I made certain changes. Morrison's voice was hard with suspicion. What kind of changes? Hoffmann stopped at the entrance to what appeared to be a dining facility, the kind that would likely see me face severe consequences if my superiors knew of them. But my superiors are either gone, captured, or no longer in any position to give orders. So I made decisions based on conscience rather than regulation. He pushed open the door, revealing a large room where perhaps 20 people sat at tables, a mix of German soldiers and civilians, eating together from a common pot of what appeared to be vegetable soup. The conversation stopped as the Americans entered, every face turning toward them with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to something that might have been hope. Walker stood in the doorway, his weapon still held ready, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected to find. These people were not starving, though they were clearly rationed and thin. They were not brutalized or terrorized. They sat together, ate together, and from all appearances, lived together in something approaching community. One of the German soldiers, a young man missing his left arm below the elbow, stood up and spoke in German to Hoffmann, his voice questioning. Hoffmann responded calmly, then translated for the Americans. "He asks if you are here to arrest us or to liberate us. I told him I am not certain there is a difference anymore." Morrison holstered his sidearm, though his expression remained cautious. "Major Hoffmann, you need to explain everything, from the beginning. What is this place, and how did it come to be what it is?" So Hoffmann told them, and Walker listened, his anger gradually giving way to confusion, and then to something more complex, something harder to define. The facility had originally been established in 1943 as a training camp for reserve units, Hoffmann explained. But as the war turned against Germany and resources became scarce, it had been converted into a holding facility for personnel deemed unfit for combat, men who were injured or psychologically unable to continue fighting, but who could not be sent home for various administrative reasons. Hoffmann himself had been assigned there in October 1944 after suffering a breakdown following months of combat on the Eastern Front. He had seen things there, he said quietly, his eyes distant, that had destroyed something essential in him. He could no longer reconcile the orders he was given with any moral framework that made sense. So when he was declared unfit for frontline service and sent to command this backwater facility, he had initially seen it as a form of exile, a punishment for his weakness. But then he had discovered that the facility was also being used to house civilian detainees, people who had been swept up in various security actions, who were being held not because they had committed any specific crime, but because they belonged to groups the regime deemed problematic. There were Polish civilians whose village had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were German citizens who had expressed doubts about the war. There were even a few individuals of Jewish heritage who had somehow survived the deportations through bureaucratic confusion or the protection of sympathetic officials. What Hoffman found appalled him. The conditions were not as brutal as in the concentration camp system, but they were degrading, dehumanizing, a microcosm of the larger injustices that had consumed his country. And he was expected to maintain these conditions, to enforce separation, to treat human beings as problems to be managed rather than people deserving of basic dignity. So I began to make changes, Hoffman continued, his voice steady but weighted with the significance of his confession. Small ones at first, ensuring that rations were distributed equally, allowing civilians access to the medical supplies we had, eliminating the more pointless restrictions that served no purpose except cruelty. As weeks passed and Germany's military situation deteriorated, Hoffman grew bolder. He began integrating the civilians and soldiers, arguing that with limited resources, it made practical sense to share facilities and labor. He stopped enforcing segregation policies, stopped treating the civilians as prisoners. When orders came down from higher command, he would acknowledge them and then proceed to ignore them, gambling that, in the chaos of a collapsing war effort, no one would notice or care what happened at one small facility in the middle of nowhere. And I was correct, Hoffman said with a bitter smile. No one came to inspect. No one verified my reports. The system was falling apart, and everyone was concerned with their own survival. So this place became something else, something that should not have existed in the regime I served. It became a community. Walker found himself unable to remain silent any longer. His voice came out harder than he intended, sharp with all the anger and pain he had accumulated. You are telling us that you, a German officer, decided to show mercy, that you chose humanity? Where was that mercy at other camps? Where was that humanity when millions were being destroyed? Hoffman turned to face Walker directly, and in his eyes Walker saw something he had not expected to see, genuine anguish and shame. You are absolutely right to ask that question, Corporal, and I have no answer that will satisfy you or satisfy my own conscience. I was part of a system that committed unforgivable crimes. I wore this uniform, I followed orders, I participated in actions that I now recognize as monstrous. The fact that I eventually found some small measure of moral courage does not absolve me of what came before. Then why should we believe any of this? Walker pressed. Why should we trust that this is not some elaborate performance designed to save your skin now that you have clearly lost? Hoffman held Walker's gaze steadily. You should not trust me based on my words, Corporal. You should judge based on what you see and what these people tell you. Speak to the civilians here. Ask them about their treatment. Ask them if they were coerced or if they chose to stay when they could have fled. The truth, whatever it is, deserves to be heard from all voices, not just mine. Lieutenant Morrison intervened. That is exactly what we intend to do, Major. You will remain here while my men interview the civilians and verify your account. What followed was a meticulous investigation. Morrison divided his soldiers, assigning them to speak with different groups of civilians, carefully separating them to ensure they could speak freely without influence from Hoffman or the German soldiers. Walker was assigned to interview a group of 3 Polish civilians, an older man named Jan Kowalski, his daughter Maria, and a younger man named Piotr, who had been a teacher before the war. They sat in one of the smaller buildings, and Walker began with direct questions about how they came to be at the facility, how they were treated, and whether they had been threatened or coerced in any way. What he heard over the next hour challenged every assumption he had brought with him into that compound. Jan Kowalski spoke first, in halting English supplemented by Piotr's translation. He described how his village had been destroyed in 1943 during anti-partisan operations, how he and his daughter had been rounded up with dozens of others and sent to a labor camp near the Czech border. The conditions there had been harsh, he said, his voice matter-of-fact in the way of someone describing facts too painful for emotion. People had perished from disease and exhaustion. Food was scarce. Hope was scarcer. Then, in the autumn of 1944, several prisoners, including Jan and Maria, had been transferred to this facility. At first they had expected more of the same, but Major Hoffman had proven different from other German officers they had encountered. "He treated us as human," Jan said through Piotr's translation. "He made sure we had enough to eat from their own supplies. When Maria became ill with fever, he gave her access to medicine meant for his soldiers. Slowly we began to understand that this place was different." Maria spoke next, her English better than her father's. She described how Hoffman had gradually eliminated the barriers between prisoners and guards, how he had organized shared work details in the camp's garden, how he had allowed them to cook together and eat together. "At first we were suspicious," she admitted. "We thought it was a trick, that he was trying to make us compliant before something terrible happened. But months passed, and the terrible thing never came. Instead, we found something unexpected. We found that even in this war, even wearing that uniform, Major Hoffman was trying to be decent." Piotr added his own perspective, describing conversations he had with some of the German soldiers, young men who had been wounded in combat, and who were themselves trying to process what they had been part of. "Many of them were struggling," Piotr explained. "They had believed in what they were told, that they were fighting for their homeland's survival, for a greater purpose. But as the war turned, and they saw the reality of what their nation had become, they began to question everything. This place became a kind of refuge for them too, a space where they could be honest about their doubts and their shame." Walker listened to all of this, his mind working to integrate information that did not fit his preconceptions. He wanted to dismiss it as deception or manipulation, but the sincerity in their voices was hard to ignore. These people were not speaking out of fear or coercion. They were telling their truth, complicated and messy as it was. "Did you have opportunities to escape?" Walker asked directly. "If you were being treated well, why did you stay?" This question seemed to surprise them, and the three Poles exchanged glances before Jan answered. "Where would we go, Corporal? Our village no longer exists. The conflict continues all around us. Here we had food, shelter, and relative safety. And," he paused, searching for words, "and we had something else. We had a chance to see that not all Germans were monsters, just as we hoped that not all of us would be judged by our worst moments." The answer unsettled Walker in ways he struggled to articulate. It suggested a moral complexity that was harder to navigate than clear-cut categories of good and evil, perpetrator and victim. It suggested that even within a system as fundamentally corrupt as the regime that had caused so much suffering, individuals could still choose differently, could still exercise agency toward decency, even if that decency was small and localized. As interviews concluded throughout the compound, a consistent picture emerged. Every civilian told essentially the same story. They had arrived expecting brutality and found something else instead. They stayed not because they were forced to, but because in the chaos of a collapsing war, this place offered something precious, a small island of humanity in an ocean of destruction. The German soldiers told their own stories, and these too complicated Walker's understanding. He spoke with a sergeant named Friedrich Weber, who had been at the facility since its conversion in 1944. Weber had lost 3 fingers on his right hand to frostbite during the winter campaign in the east, and his unit had been decimated in the fighting. When he arrived at the facility, he admitted, he was angry and bitter, looking for someone to blame for the catastrophe that had befallen his nation. "Major Hoffman changed my perspective," Weber said. His English learned from a grandmother who had lived in London before the first great conflict. He did not lecture us or preach. He simply treated everyone, German or civilian, soldier or refugee, as human beings worthy of respect. And seeing that, day after day, made it impossible to maintain the hate I had been carrying. Walker posed the question that burned in his mind. "But you must have known what was happening elsewhere. You must have known about the camps, the deportations, the systematic destruction of entire populations. How can you square what happened here with what your nation was doing everywhere else?" Weber's face darkened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "We knew, Corporal. Perhaps not all the details, perhaps not the full scope, but we knew enough. And that knowledge is something I will carry for the rest of my life. What we did here, what Major Hoffman allowed us to do, does not erase any of that. It does not balance the scales or earn forgiveness. But it was all we could do. In this small place with these specific people, we chose differently than the regime we served. It is not enough, but it is what we have." The honesty of that answer, the refusal to excuse or minimize, struck Walker with unexpected force. This was not a man seeking absolution or trying to escape responsibility. This was someone wrestling with genuine moral reckoning, trying to hold both truths simultaneously, that he had been part of something monstrous, and that he had also, in one small way, chosen humanity over ideology. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the compound, Lieutenant Morrison assembled his men to discuss their findings. They gathered at the perimeter, away from the facility's inhabitants, and Morrison asked each soldier to report what they had learned. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Every interview supported Hoffman's basic narrative. The civilians were not prisoners in any meaningful sense. The German soldiers were not guards, but fellow residents trying to survive the collapse of everything they had known. And Major Hoffman had indeed created something anomalous, a small pocket of decency within a system defined by its cruelty. "So what do we do?" Morrison asked his men. "This is not a situation covered in our orders or training." Corporal Davis spoke first. "We should document everything and report up the chain of command. Let the brass figure out how to handle it." Another soldier suggested bringing in military police to process everyone according to proper procedures, treating the German soldiers as prisoners of war and the civilians as displaced persons requiring assistance. Then Morrison turned to Walker. "Corporal Walker, you have been quiet. What is your assessment?" Walker had been wrestling with his thoughts throughout the interviews, trying to reconcile what he had found with what he had expected, trying to balance his anger at German crimes with the complicated reality before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, each word chosen deliberately. "Sir, I came here today ready to confront enemies. I came here carrying anger at everything this regime has done, all the suffering it has caused, and that anger is still justified. Nothing we have found here changes the fundamental evil of what Germany did during this conflict." But he paused, his eyes moving to the compound where people were beginning to prepare an evening meal. "What we found here is not what I expected. We found people, Germans and civilians, who somehow created something decent in an indecent time. And I think," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "I think we have to acknowledge that complexity. We cannot let this small example excuse the larger crimes, but we also should not dismiss it as irrelevant." Morrison nodded slowly. "So what should we do, specifically?" Walker thought for a moment. "We should document everything, as Davis suggested. We should ensure that all the civilians get proper assistance and resettlement. The German soldiers should be processed as prisoners of war, which is their right under international law. But," and he met Morrison's eyes directly, "we should also make sure that Major Hoffman's actions are part of the official record. Not to excuse him, but because the truth matters. If we only record the atrocities and never record the moments when individuals chose differently, we lose something important about understanding how humans actually behave in impossible situations." Morrison considered this, then looked around at his other men. "Anyone disagree with Corporal Walker's assessment?" Silence greeted the question, and after a moment Morrison made his decision. "Very well, we will do as Corporal Walker suggests. We document everything, we ensure everyone is processed properly, and we make sure the full truth is reported. Davis, you will coordinate with military police. Walker, you will work with the civilians to prepare them for transfer to proper displaced persons camps. I will handle the report to command." As his men dispersed to their assignments, Morrison pulled Walker aside. "That was good thinking, Corporal. It takes more courage to see complexity than to maintain simple categories of good and evil." Walker shook his head slightly. "I am not sure it is courage, sir. I'm just trying to be honest about what we found." The next several hours were busy with documentation and preparation. Walker found himself working alongside Major Hoffman to organize the civilians for eventual transfer, and in the course of that work, They had several extended conversations that would stay with Walker for the rest of his life. At one point, as they were inventorying supplies, Walker asked the question that had been nagging at him since the morning. "Major Hoffman, why did you do this? What made you decide to act differently than your orders and your regime demanded?" Hoffman was silent for a long moment, his hands continuing their work as he thought. Finally, he responded, "I do not have a simple answer, Corporal Walker. I was not always a good man. I followed orders I should have questioned. I participated in actions I now recognize as criminal. But there came a moment, sometime during that terrible winter in the East, when I saw a line of civilians being forced to march through snow in inadequate clothing, and I realized I had a choice. I could continue to be the person I had been, following orders and suppressing my conscience, or I could try, however imperfectly, to be someone different." He set down the inventory papers and looked at Walker directly. "I chose to try to be different, even though I knew it was too late to matter for most. Even though I knew it would not balance the evil I had already been part of. I chose it because the alternative was to accept that I was completely lost, that there was nothing redeemable left in me. This facility, these people, they gave me a chance to prove to myself that I still had some shred of humanity. It was selfish, in a way. I needed this as much as they did. The honesty of that confession, the refusal to claim noble motives or heroic purpose, struck Walker as deeply authentic. This was not a man seeking praise or redemption. This was someone trying to survive with some fragment of his soul intact. "Do you think what you did here matters?" Walker asked. "Given the scale of what your nation did, can these small acts of decency actually mean anything?" Hoffman smiled sadly. "That is the question that keeps me awake at night, Corporal. I do not know if it matters in any cosmic or historical sense. Millions suffered and perished. My nation committed crimes that will echo through history. What happened in this small facility cannot balance that scale." But he gestured around at the people working together to prepare for the transition ahead. For these specific people in this specific moment, it mattered. "Maria Kowalski lived instead of perished because of medicine I provided. Jan Kowalski has his daughter beside him instead of in an anonymous grave. Is that enough? No. Does it matter to them? Yes." Walker found he had no response to that because Hoffman was right. The moral calculus was impossible to resolve. Individual acts of decency did not excuse systematic evil, but they also could not be dismissed as meaningless. They existed in a complicated middle ground where most of actual human morality lived, far from the clear absolutes that made judgment easy. As evening fell, Major Hoffman gathered everyone in the compound, German soldiers and civilians together, and explained what would happen next. American forces would be processing everyone. The civilians would be transferred to displaced persons camps where they would receive assistance in finding new homes or reconnecting with surviving family. The German soldiers would become prisoners of war, held according to international conventions until the conflict formally ended. "We have known this day would come," Hoffman said to the assembled group, speaking in German with Piotr translating for those who needed it. "We have known that what we created here was temporary, a small shelter in a larger storm. But I want you to remember what we proved to each other in these months. We proved that, even in the darkest times, even within the worst systems, individual human beings can still choose kindness. We proved that our common humanity is stronger than the divisions that nations and ideologies try to impose upon us." He paused, and Walker saw tears in the eyes of several people, both German and civilian. "I have no right to ask for forgiveness," Hoffman continued. "I've been part of something unforgivable. But I am grateful that I was given the chance to end my service differently than I began it. I'm grateful that you all gave me the opportunity to remember what it means to be human." In the silence that followed, Maria Kowalski stood up and walked over to Major Hoffman. She said something in Polish that Piotr did not immediately translate. Then she embraced the German officer. Others followed. Civilians and soldiers both, coming together in a moment of shared acknowledgement that what they had experienced together was real and significant, even if the world beyond would never fully understand it. Walker watched this scene from the edge of the gathering, his emotions turbulent and difficult to process. Part of him remained angry, convinced that these gestures of reconciliation were premature, that too much evil had been committed for such easy forgiveness. But another part of him, a part he had not fully acknowledged until that moment, recognized something profound in what he was witnessing. He was seeing humans being human, complicated and flawed and capable of both terrible cruelty and surprising compassion. Later that night, after the military police had arrived and begun the formal processing, Walker found himself sitting alone near the compound's garden, looking up at stars that shone indifferent to human conflict. Major Hoffman approached and asked permission to sit beside him. Walker nodded, and for several minutes they sat in silence, two men on opposite sides of a vast divide, trying to understand what had transpired between them. Finally, Walker spoke. "Major Hoffman, I need you to understand something. What you did here, it is notable. But it does not erase anything. It does not balance the scales. Your nation, your regime committed crimes that will forever stain history, and you were part of that. Whether you personally pulled triggers or simply wore the uniform and followed orders." Hoffman nodded. "I know, Corporal Walker, and I would never presume to claim otherwise." Walker continued, his voice steady but intense. "But I also need to acknowledge that you showed me something today I did not expect to see. You showed me that even within evil systems, individuals retain some capacity for choice. Not enough choice to stop the machine, maybe, but enough to create small pockets of decency. And I suppose," he paused, searching for the right words, "I suppose that is important to recognize. Because if we deny that possibility, if we say that everyone within an evil system is equally and completely evil, then we lose something important about understanding how human morality actually works." Hoffman turned to look at Walker, his expression thoughtful. "That is a generous interpretation, Corporal. More generous than I deserve." "It is not about what you deserve," Walker replied. "It is about what is true, and the truth is complicated. You are a war criminal who showed mercy. Those two facts both exist simultaneously. I do not know how to resolve that contradiction, but I know I cannot ignore either half of it." They sat together for a while longer, and then Hoffman asked a question that surprised Walker. "May I ask, Corporal, why you came here today expecting revenge? What experiences brought you to that emotional state?" Walker found himself answering honestly, describing the horrors he had witnessed during the liberation of other facilities, the faces of survivors that haunted his dreams, the accumulating weight of bearing witness to systematic cruelty. "And I am black," Walker added. "I have lived my entire life in a nation that claims freedom and equality, but denies both to people who look like me. So when I saw what your regime did, the way it classified people as lesser based on arbitrary characteristics, it resonated with my own experiences of injustice, and that made my anger deeper, more personal." Hoffman listened without interrupting, and when Walker finished, he said quietly, "I cannot speak to your experiences in your own nation, Corporal Walker, but I recognize the dynamic you describe, the way systematic dehumanization functions, the way it allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil, and I am ashamed that I was part of such a system. I hope that you and your nation can find a better path than we did." The conversation wound down eventually, and they parted with a handshake that felt heavy with significance, a gesture of mutual recognition that could not resolve their complicated moral positions, but could acknowledge the shared humanity that persisted despite everything. Over the following days, as the processing continued and the camp's inhabitants were gradually dispersed to their various destinations, Walker found himself thinking constantly about the implications of what he had experienced. He wrote long letters to his family back in Detroit, trying to explain the moral complexity of what he had found, struggling to convey how his quest for simple justice had become entangled with messy human reality. His fellow soldiers noticed the change in him. Where before he had been burning with righteous anger, now he seemed more contemplative, more willing to sit with difficult questions rather than demanding immediate answers. Corporal Davis asked him one evening if he was okay, if the experience at the compound had somehow broken something in him. Walker thought about that question carefully before answering. "Not broken," he finally said. "Complicated. I came to Europe thinking I understood the moral stakes clearly. We were fighting against pure evil, and that made us purely good. But what I found at that compound showed me that real morality is messier than that. We are still fighting against evil, yes. The regime we are helping to defeat committed unforgivable crimes, but within that evil system, there were still individual humans making individual choices, and some of those choices were toward decency rather than cruelty. Recognizing that does not excuse the larger evil, but ignoring it makes us less capable of understanding how humans actually function in moral crisis. Davis considered this. So what changed for you? I stopped looking for revenge, Walker said simply. I started looking for understanding. And understanding is harder than revenge because it requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. It requires acknowledging that Major Hoffman is both a war criminal who served an evil regime and a man who created a pocket of humanity within that evil. Both things are true. I cannot pick which truth to focus on and ignore the other. The 761st Tank Battalion moved on from that region in late April, as the final collapse of organized German resistance accelerated. Within weeks, the conflict in Europe would officially end, and soldiers like Walker would face the challenge of returning to civilian life, carrying with them the weight of everything they had experienced. But Walker never forgot what happened at that small facility in the German countryside. Years later, after returning to Detroit and eventually becoming a teacher himself, he would tell the story to his students when they studied the war in Europe. He would describe the horrors he had witnessed, making clear the systematic evil of the regime that had caused so much suffering. But he would also describe what he found on April 12, 1945, when he entered a compound expecting enemies and found instead a complicated community of humans trying to preserve their decency in indecent times. The story became his way of teaching about moral complexity, about how real ethics functions in the messy realm of human behavior, rather than in the clean abstractions of philosophical thought. He would tell his students that Major Hoffman was never absolved of his crimes, that he remained a complicated figure whose actions existed in moral ambiguity. But Walker would also insist that the small acts of decency mattered, that they represented real choices made by real people, and that understanding those choices was essential to understanding how humans navigate extreme circumstances. Some students would push back, arguing that any discussion of German soldiers showing mercy was a distraction from the larger crimes, that it risked creating false equivalencies or minimizing genuine evil. Walker would nod at these objections, acknowledging their validity, and then he would say what he came to believe through hard-won experience. We can hold both truths at once. We can acknowledge systematic evil while also recognizing individual agency within that system. We can insist on justice while also understanding mercy. The work of moral clarity is not to flatten complexity into simple categories, but to maintain rigorous honesty about what actually happened in all its contradictions. The civilians from the compound scattered to various destinations after the war. Jan and Maria Kowalski eventually settled in Chicago, where they rebuilt their lives among a large Polish immigrant community. Piotr returned to Poland despite the complicated political situation there, determined to participate in his nation's recovery. Others found homes throughout Europe and beyond, carrying with them the unexpected memory of a place where former enemies had chosen coexistence over conflict. Major Klaus Hoffmann was processed as a prisoner of war and eventually repatriated to Germany after his release in 1947. Records suggest he lived quietly in a small town in southern Germany, working as a clerk and avoiding any public discussion of his wartime service. He corresponded occasionally with some of the civilians who had been at the facility, letters that expressed continued remorse for his participation in the regime's crimes, while also acknowledging the bond they had formed during those final months of the conflict. Friedrich Weber, the German Sergeant Walker had interviewed, emigrated to Argentina in the early 1950s, seeking distance from memories that haunted him. Before leaving Europe, he wrote a letter to Walker, who was by then back in Detroit. In it, Weber thanked Walker for treating him as a human being capable of moral complexity rather than simply as an enemy. He wrote that the American corporal's willingness to see him fully as both perpetrator and someone trying to choose differently had given him the courage to continue living with the weight of what he had been part of. Walker kept that letter for the rest of his life, filed away with other mementos from the war. He would occasionally take it out and reread it, reminded of the day his certainty about enemies and justice had been complicated by the messy reality of human beings making choices under extreme pressure. The facility itself was eventually dismantled in the years after the conflict, its buildings repurposed or torn down. The land returned to forest, leaving little physical evidence of what had transpired there. But in the memories of those who had been present, and in the stories they told their families and friends, the place continued to exist as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals could still choose compassion over cruelty, community over division. For James Walker, the experience fundamentally shaped his understanding of morality and justice. He had entered that compound on April 12, 1945, carrying the righteous anger of someone who had witnessed genuine evil and sought righteous confrontation. He had expected to find perpetrators who deserved punishment, and he had been prepared to deliver judgment. What he found instead was infinitely more complicated. He found humans, flawed and compromised, who had nonetheless created something worth recognizing. He found that moral clarity sometimes required acknowledging ambiguity, that justice demanded honest accounting, even when that accounting revealed uncomfortable truths. The lesson stayed with him through the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, as Walker participated in the fight for equality in his own nation. He drew on what he had learned about how systems of oppression function, how ordinary people can participate in or resist those systems, how individuals retain moral agency even within structures designed to constrain that agency. He became known in his community as someone who could condemn injustice fiercely, while also recognizing the humanity of those caught up in unjust systems, someone who demanded change while also offering the possibility of redemption for those willing to change. His students would sometimes ask if he ever regretted not seeking revenge against Major Hoffman and the German soldiers at that facility, if he felt he had been too soft or too willing to accept their explanations. Walker would shake his head firmly. "Revenge would have been easy," he would say. "Revenge would have satisfied my anger in that moment. But it would not have taught me anything. It would not have helped me understand how humans actually function in moral crisis. What I gained instead was much more valuable, even if it was harder. I gained the knowledge that moral judgment requires the courage to see clearly, to acknowledge complexity, to refuse simple categories, even when simple categories would be more comfortable." In his final years, long after the conflict had receded into history, Walker would reflect on how that single day in April 1945 had changed his understanding of human nature. He had learned that people were not simply good or evil, hero or villain, victim or perpetrator. They were capable of being multiple things simultaneously, of carrying contradictions within themselves, of making choices that complicated easy moral narratives, and that lesson, perhaps more than any other he learned during the war, had proven essential to navigating a complicated world. It had taught him to look for understanding before judgment, to seek truth in its full complexity rather than in simplified versions, to recognize that real moral progress required acknowledging the messy reality of human behavior in all its contradictory manifestations. The story of what happened at that small facility in the German countryside never became widely known. It was too complicated for simple narrative, too ambiguous for clear lessons, too personal to translate easily into public memory. But for those who were there and for those who heard their stories, it remained a powerful reminder that even in humanity's darkest chapters, individuals could still make choices that mattered, could still create small spaces of decency, could still recognize the shared humanity that persisted beneath all the divisions of nation and ideology. James Walker carried that knowledge with him until his passing in 1998, and he passed it on to hundreds of students who learned from his example that moral courage sometimes means accepting complexity rather than demanding simplicity, that justice requires rigorous honesty about what actually happened rather than comfortable stories about clear-cut good and evil. The morning of April 12, 1945, had begun with Walker seeking enemies and revenge. It ended with him recognizing the complicated truth that enemies were also human beings, that revenge was less important than understanding, and that the real work of morality happened in the difficult space between absolute condemnation and easy forgiveness. That recognition did not make him naive or soft. It made him wiser, more capable of navigating moral complexity, better equipped to pursue justice without sacrificing his own humanity in the process. And that, in the end, was the transformation that mattered most. James Walker had entered that compound ready to deliver judgment, and he left it prepared to do something much harder, to live with ambiguity, to insist on truth in all its complexity, and to remember that moral clarity sometimes requires acknowledging what we would rather deny, that even in evil systems, humans retain the capacity for choice, and that recognizing that capacity is essential to understanding both the depths to which humanity can sink and the heights to which it can occasionally unexpectedly rise. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.